Thank you so much, Annie. Thank you all for being here. I was just telling Annie that the more connected I feel to an audience, the more nervous I am because the more I want to be of service to you. It is, therefore, a great honor that I feel to be here, and I'm trying to pack a lot into this talk. I'd like to start, though, with a line that I stole from D. Hock, which just seems to sort of get at it. He writes, "It is far too late, and things are far too bad for pessimism." And that's how I feel. That's how I feel. We can't waste time with that. So here is where I begin. It is not massive, needless hunger. It is not climate chaos. It is not terrorism that is the crisis. The only crisis that we have to worry about is people's feelings of powerlessness to address these crises. That is the only thing we have to focus on, in my view. Because solutions, as you know, solutions are known to each of these problems. Solutions are known. Hunger. We now are predicting 150 million more people just over the last 2 years period going hungry, and yet we've had bumper harvests. We have more than enough food in the world to feed us all. And we know now that organic agriculture, there was a wonderful new study at the University of Michigan. We know that based on that study, interdisciplinary, scholarly study, that if the whole planet went organic, we could actually increase food availability by 50%. Solutions are known. If we talk about the energy crisis, we know that the global climate crisis, we know that if you take Amory Lovin's estimates and even double them, that with a modest investment of $30 or so billion a year, it's modest relative to what we're now faced with this financial crisis, that in 10 years we could beat all fossil fuels. We know how to end poverty. In my generation, the 1960s, in 1 decade, we cut the rate of poverty in half in this country. We know how to do it. So, my case is that the problems aren't the crisis. The crisis is only people's feeling of powerlessness to address these crises. So that's what we have to focus on like a laser. This is the question then. What could be powerful enough, possibly be powerful enough, to have this really smart species creating as societies a world that as individuals none of us would choose, not one of us would choose. Whether you would be in an audience like this or anyone on street of any place in this planet, nobody would say, yes, I think we should heat the planet and wipe out species and make people starve needlessly. So, what could be powerful enough to have us creating this world that we as individuals for? Well, I don't think it's George Bush. And I don't think it's that guy in the cave somewhere in Afghanistan or Pakistan. I think there's only one thing powerful enough, and that is the power of ideas. The power of ideas. That this is the great virtue and the great Achilles heel of our species. That we are creatures of the mind. We each see the world through filters. We see the world according to the ideas that we hold that tell us what is our nature, what is the nature of nature, and therefore what is possible. We call it, my daughter and I, in our book Hope's Edge, we call it our mental map. That's just who we are. And increasingly scientists are telling us exactly that. There is no unfiltered reality for a human being. So, it's okay. It's okay if our mental maps are life-serving. But I'm arguing with you this morning, or I'm offering an hypothesis this morning, that the dominant mental map, the one that we absorb like an invisible ether in this culture, is taking us down. It's fundamentally anti-life. And I'm going to try to briefly summarize that before I get into the real heart of my talk. This mental map starts with, this mental map, let me say first of all, the way I visualize it in my little book, I begin with a graphic. If you pull out the front cover, you'll see this graphic. The mental map is a spiral of powerlessness coming from the dominant mechanical worldview. And this spiral of powerlessness begins with a single premise, begins with the premise of not enough, the premise of lack. There's not enough of anything, right? There's not enough energy. There's not enough food. There's not enough love. There's not enough parking places in Boston where there's not enough. The premise of lack. There's not enough goods, that sort of stuff, and there's not enough goodness, meaning that we believe that we lack what it takes. We lack the qualities, the virtues, the values that it takes. We're not good enough to meet this crisis, to meet this challenge. So the lack of goods and goodness is at the center of the spiral of powerlessness, because if we truly believe in this premise of lack of goods and goodness, then we're led to think that we do have to find somebody else to figure it out. We do have to turn over our fate to some impersonal force bigger than ourselves, some infallible force. Ronald Reagan called it the magic of the market. Now, unfortunately, it's not magical. Unfortunately, it's based on one rule. As we know, the market, and you all are involved in the market, it's a glorious thing within a democracy, within democratic values. But left to its own devices, what we have come up to with in our culture, what we kind of accept as a norm, is that one rule can create a viable market. Our economy driven by one rule, highest return to existing wealth, people who own the shares in companies. One rule economics then leads inevitably to an increasing concentration of wealth, so that we have today, we have reached the point where one family controls as much as 40% of the U.S. population. Do you know who that family is? Yes, the Waltons. So we reach the point then that we all should have learned as kids when we played Monopoly that, that at the end of the night, when you finally got to go to bed, it's because one person had all the property. And I have to say, as a kid, I was kind of relieved, even though my brother usually won, because it meant I could go to bed. In a game, that's okay. In real life, it's not okay. It's not okay. It means death. So this spiral of powerlessness starts with the premise of lack, ends up then with creating such concentrated power that it does then appear to be that everybody is these selfish little critters who don't have enough goodness in them, and we can say, see, look what human beings have done. They have to be necessarily these selfish little materialists out to get their stuff, or they wouldn't have created this monstrous situation where so many are suffering so needlessly. So then that reinforces this premise of lack of goods and goodness, because people actually experience lack. And so we say, see, there it is. There's not enough. There's not enough goods, got enough goodness. So this spiral of lack then is then fundamentally malaligned with nature. The nature of our ecological realities as a nature of human nature. It is fundamentally malaligned. By its very assumptions, it ends up with such concentrated power that it brings out the worst in human beings. And if you look at the grand or not so grand sweep of human history now, we can be very sober and very realistic at identifying what brings out the worst in us. And we know those conditions, and I'll boil them down to 3. Concentrated power, anonymity, and scapegoating. Failure to take responsibility ourselves and blaming the other, somewhere up there. So we know what conditions, and what I'm saying is this spiral of powerlessness leads precisely to the conditions that bring out the worst in us and don't bring forth the best in us. And later in my talk, I'm going to talk about the prosocial qualities in our nature that are right there to be tapped, and that the cooperative movement and the movement that you all are part of taps those deep social needs for fairness, cooperation, our capacity for empathy, and our need for efficacy, for power. These deep, deep, hardwired qualities in us are tamped down and are thwarted in the dominant mechanical worldview that is bringing us down, down, down from this premise of lack. That it thwarts these deep, hardwired, positive needs, so much so that and this is a hunch, I can't prove it, but I'm really convinced that the epidemic of depression worldwide, the epidemic of depression, there are now 50% more suicides in the world than there are homicides. This epidemic of depression is because we're living with a worldview that is malaligned with our nature, that fails to tap the best in us or protect us from the worst in us. And so I'm going to bring this right to the environmental movement that we all can identify with. Suggests that what is now possible as we see the limits of what happens, the consequences of what happens when we start from the premise of lack, and that takes us into this sense of powerlessness and these structures of control that make us increasingly feel powerless, that it could be the moment as we see the failure, and it's going on now and as never so visible perhaps in my lifetime with the meltdown of the financial industry, where this worldview is taking us, that it could be the moment where there is a quickening of an emergence of a worldview that is more scientifically, if you will, aligned with our nature, human nature and its complexity, and with with ecology itself. And that is really my premise, that what is emerging as a possibility is that we are letting go of the notion of we inherited a very fixed and finished world, a fixed and finished democracy here in America, and beginning to move into an ecological worldview that is radically different assumptions, that starts with the premise of possibility, not of lack, that understands that the world is not fixed and finished, but it is ever evolving, it is interconnected in networks, and none of us is separate from it. As Hans-Peter Dürer, the physicist in Germany, said to me recently, he said, Frankie, there are no parts in an ecological worldview. There are only participants. There are no parts. There are only participants. And that puts us all on the hook. No longer can we say, oh, it's somebody else up there. We are all interconnected moment to moment in creating our world. And how different that looks. So I think in entering this world of possibility rather than fixed and finished and somebody else's job, this is what helps me, and I'll just again part of my wind up here, what helps me is reminding myself constantly that actually what we're experiencing in the worst forms of what we're experiencing in this moment in the early 21st century is a brief aberration. My lifetime, basically. I just noticed, I've just really focused on this recently, that half the increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, half the increase, has occurred since I was a teenager. And that since I was born in 1944, that we have used twice as much fixed non-renewable energy than in all of human history up until that time. My lifetime, that's no time. I mean, really, in historical terms. So this is not business as usual. This is not convention. What we are experiencing today, those of you born of my generation and since, this is not business as usual. Let's drop the whole... One of the words that I most hate is the word conventional. I have to say, when I go into stores and see conventional foods versus organic, we got to change that. There is nothing conventional. This is a detour, skidding off the road. This is an aberration. This is an experiment that has failed. So, So how do we find the messages to reinforce in ourselves daily and with all of those we want to reach who know there is something terribly wrong and want to feel part of the solution but feel so overwhelmed that they want to block out the consequences of heating our planet or the consequences of global poverty and on and on? How do we reach out? Let's examine our messaging. Let's examine our messages. Because remember, all the polls, if you ask people, are they willing to sacrifice to save our planet's environment? The vast majority say yes. And every other measure related to social justice, people are with us. So what's missing? I believe part of it is how we talk about what we're doing, what we stand for. So I just want to mention 5 messages that I hear from environmentalist buddies of mine that I want to challenge us to reframe this morning. And I'm just going to start with one. I've heard a lot. We've got to power down. We've got to get used to bleaker lives, therefore, without fossil fuel. Well, here's my take on this, is that actually the language, for example, World Watch Institute, which I love their materials, but they write in their most recent the mic is coming in and out, right? I don't know if anything can be done, but I don't think there's anything I can do differently. So either we'll live with it or do something. Maybe listening because you wonder when she's coming back. Okay, he's on it. Great. They write, fossil fuels made all the quote-unquote material accomplishments of the modern economy possible. And in their wonderful, in some ways, green economics textbook, Ecological Economics, which I rushed out to get, Herman Daly, who I admire, Joshua Farley, a professor in Vermont, tells us that, quote, fossil fuels freed us from the fixed energy flow of the sun. Thank you for laughing, because I read this. What are they talking about? Thank you. Nobody else has ever laughed at that line. But, I thought, wait a minute. Each day, German energy scientist expert Hermann Scheer tells us, each day, the sun provides us 15,000 times the dose of energy that we're now using in fossil fuels. Freedom? I think that actually, this is not fixed in any practical sense. The energy of the sun is not even renewable, right? It is renewing. We can't stop it. It's not like we have to renew it. So the idea that somehow fossil fuels have in any way freed us is the frame we've got to drop. Because what I'm guessing, my hunch is that we humans will look back a few hundred years from now on this era and they'll say, on this aberration, on this detour that we took with fossil fuels, and said, oh my God, this concentrated energy, which is so nasty, this concentrated energy of fossil fuel led inexorably to concentrated social power. And you've heard the curse of oil? Yes, every place where there is this concentrated energy, then human beings concentrate their power over other human beings, and it's a nightmare. And so my hunch is that we'll look back and say, oh, the end of fossil fuels was the beginning of real democracy. That is what my hope. But then we get to disempowering message number 2, which is that growth is the problem, so we must move from growth to no growth. Growth to no growth. Well, here's my problem with that. I used to say, here's my beef, but I'm trying to clean up language that I've cleaned up my diet for a few centuries, a few decades. But what people hear when they hear that is that we can't afford the goodies anymore, right? The party's over. We can't afford the goodies anymore. We've had this wonderful party, but it's over. And, of course, there are those who say, wait a minute, you didn't invite me to the party. which is most of the planet. But there's another problem with this message of growth to no growth, and that is that it kind of blesses what we've been doing as growth. No, 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 no. No. When I was sitting in that UC Berkeley library in 1968, and I discovered that we've created a protein disposal system. We feed 16 pounds of grain and soy to get 1 pound of steak back. I said, oh, that's pretty crazy. We're actually creating scarcity. This must be an aberration. And then I looked at other parts since then over the decades and realized, oh, that's the norm. That's the rule. We just create waste. Even the New York Times, a few months ago, they were a big report estimating that 56% of the energy in the United States is wasted. Study of food, you probably have all seen. 40 to 50% of the food that's ready for harvest in the U.S., wasted. But, of course, Amory Lovins, Paul Hawken in their wonderful book, and Hunter Lovins, their wonderful book, Natural Capitalism, they draw on a study that says that of all the resources that are mobilized to bring us our tablecloth, the chairs, my pants, my shoes, everything, of all that's mobilized, only 6% of it ends up in actual products that we use. 6% of it. Amory Lovins also estimates that in automobiles in the U.S., 87% of the energy is wasted. So, why don't we call what we've been doing waste? And talk about and redefine growth as that which enhances life. Growth is wonderful. My grandbaby is growing. I love it. I want her to stay a little baby, but I still love her growth. You know, we love growth. This beautiful B&B I was staying at, you know, with the incredible vistas and the animals growing. We love growth. So let's call what we've been doing waste and destruction and call that what enhances the diversity and richness of ecology. Let's call that growth. And, on this point, though, I don't want to leave this point until I encourage us, though, to figure out ways, very simple ways, and this is what I'm trying to do in my little book, Getting a Grip, is to explain to people more and more carefully and succinctly how the dominant worldview, the spiral of powerlessness that leads us to this one rule economy, how it creates scarcity, how it creates waste. And certainly, at least in two ways. One, as I'm saying, this one rule economy ends up absolutely defying the regenerative powers of nature. It absolutely, interrupts nature's regenerative flows. And it so concentrates power that it then infuses and distorts our political thinking, as we now see so strongly. There are more than 24 lobbyists in Washington for every single representative of us that we voted to represent our interests there. $16 million a day spent on lobbying efforts. So I'm saying that the way that our dominant worldview ends up in this concentrated power, then both economic and political, and then we end up creating rules that then reinforce the destruction of nature. So we've got to get better and better at explaining how what we've been calling growth, not only that it is waste, but how that waste is created. But when I get to this point, and then talk about the need to align our economic rules with nature's regenerative power, and that there need be then no scarcity of things of value to us, then I get to another message that is dominant in our culture that we have to confront. And that is that we have to overcome human nature, in effect. And many of my environmental heroes, in one way or another, imply this. When I love to listen to Robert Kennedy Jr. speak, for example, and yet there's a message inherent in his talks that is oh, humans are selfish and we have to transcend our basic nature. Or E.O. Wilson wrote recently in a foreword to an important book, E.O. Wilson wrote that we have to move beyond our quote-unquote Stone Age emotions. And a well-known British writer wrote recently, we evolved to suit a way of life that was acquisitive, territorial, and combative. We have only about 6,000 years to overcome millions of years of evolution. If I believed that, I would be really scared, and I would be one of those pre-suicidals. So if we really believe that we are hardwired in a way and we have to actually change our nature, then I think that's pretty discouraging. So what I'm arguing is that we don't have to change human nature at all, that we are plenty good enough. It's whether or not we create the social rules and norms that reinforce that, what we know is positive in ourselves. See, I think we have to totally own up to the fact that history shows us that we can be incredibly cruel and seem to take pleasure, some of us, in subjugating others. That's undeniable. And, of course, we also know that we have deep, deep pro-social needs and capacities. And I just want to mention a few of those because we are hardwired. For example, we are hardwired to cooperate. They've discovered, as they look at our brains in these wonderful news, I just love the new neuroscience, looking at us and seeing things that we know every day, but they have to discover it with their MRI scans. They looked at us when we were cooperating, when we were competing, and you know what they found? That when people cooperate, that parts of their brains are stimulated that are the same as when we eat chocolate. And another study that I just love, Science was reporting this, that they gave a group of subjects a bunch of money and instructed them to spend it on themselves. They gave another group of people a bunch of money and said, go buy something for somebody else. And at the end of the period, they measured their happiness. And guess what? Of course, the people who bought gifts were happier. But what was so interesting, so telling, is that they were all surprised. They had so bought, literally, the idea that me makes us happy, that they were actually surprised that buying something for somebody else is what made them happy. So we do this joy in cooperation. And then, of course, there's our evidence of our near primate relatives like rhesus monkeys in terms of empathy. Think of this. I like to think we humans are at least as empathetic as rhesus monkeys, right? Well, rhesus monkeys, in this terrible experiment, will forego food for up to 12 days. If to eat themselves, they have to press a lever that they know will give an electric shock to another monkey. They will withgo food for 12 days. So we are hardwired for empathy. And if I can just tell you one little grandbaby story here. My little Josie, who's 2, I was just talking to my son Anthony. He said, Mom, has she done this with you yet? She comes up to me and she says, Daddy, are you sad? Daddy, would you cry? And then he fakes crying and she comforts him. So she's practicing her empathy. But it just was kind of a sweet story about how she understood that it's fun to be empathetic, and she wanted an opportunity by getting her dad to cry. And we also have a deep need for fairness. Speaking of little kids, it's not fair, it's not fair. That's hardwired, and it makes perfect sense. We evolved in close-knit tribes where we knew that what holds things together is fair rules, fairly applied. And we know what tears community apart is when rules aren't fair or when somebody's cheating and not paying a price for cheating. And so fairness, I'm convinced, is part of what we evolved knowing was true to our survival needs. And I love on this point to quote Adam Smith. Now, Adam Smith is often called the godfather of greed. the invisible hand and all of that if we just looked out for ourselves. But actually, he was a profound moral philosopher who understood our need for justice. And he wrote that other social sentiments may be optional, but there's one that's not. He said, we, quote, are in some peculiar manner tied, bound, and obliged to the observation of justice. And he was talking about in the context of we know that our preservation depends on it. So that is yet another deep, deep need. But equally important is that we couldn't have made it to this point, we humans, if we were fundamentally couch potatoes and whiners. We couldn't have made it. So we are, what are we? We're problem solvers. And you too, you as a group are just emblematic of that. You are problem solvers. You are doers. You are risk takers. That's what it means to be fully alive. And that's what it means to be a human. We are not just orders takers and, as I say, complainers. So I'm saying then that we don't have to change human nature. Wow, what a relief, because I don't think we'd be very good at that in the next million years. We don't have to change human nature, but we do have to change our idea so that we can know what it takes to set the rules and new norms that bring out those qualities in us. That's what we have to be about. But as soon as I say that, I hit disempowering message number 4, which is that when I talk about creating the democratic rules and norms, then what I hear somewhere in the back of my head is, but human beings hate rules. Human beings hate rules, so we have to force people to do the right thing. Well, I'm going to argue with that too. Because, again, back to toddlers, where I seem to be focusing these days with Josie. But you know how that cliche that little kids need rules, need boundaries to feel loved? I think it's true for all of us at every age in life. It is a sense of boundaries, a sense of common sense of agreements, if you will, that give our lives purpose and meaning and make us feel connected to others who are also accepting those same rules and norms and boundaries. And it seems commonsensical to me that that is the way human beings find happiness. Whether we think about marriage vows or the Constitution or the Bill of Rights or the Ten Commandments or any other things, that little kids learn, in kindergarten and now increasingly helping to set their own rules, like, yeah, we're not going to hit. That's a rule that makes us all feel better. And then we know what's up. And we know there are consequences. That is what makes us happy, not sad. And so I'm saying that we love rules if they don't seem arbitrary, if they seem commonsensical, and if we can, see the logic in them, and if we feel that we've had some part in choosing to accept those rules. And now here we are at this great moment where we're recognizing, oh yeah, nature itself has some pretty non-arbitrary laws. Isn't that wonderful? We don't have to make it all up. All we have to do is to understand more deeply. And now that we have all the new ecological science, understand more deeply what are nature's unalterable laws, if you will. And then we align with those. Oh, what a relief. We don't have to make it up. That sounds good to me. And if we feel that we are part of making the rules, and I just, then they catch on pretty fast. And in that light, I was just so moved when I was reading about a couple of things. One, what I call the reward renewables law in Germany. Many of you, do you know about that law a little more than 10 years ago? Do you know what I'm talking about? Well, it's in one law, which says whether you're a householder or a utility, if you create renewable energy, you will be paid for it at a price that you can count on for the next 20 years. Overall, it cost each householder in Germany about $2 a month for this law. This one law means that by 2025, 28, almost half of German electricity will be from renewables. just with that one law. It was just a simple framework that meant that everybody could participate in creating energy. It was power to the people in its best sense. We are all participants in this. It is distributing the source makers of renewable energy. Or I think the story that many of you, I'm sure, are aware of in San Francisco, where the city council decided to, or the board of supervisors, I guess they call it, decided to ban plastic bags. And like, you know, 1 million or so, it's just amazing, you know, per month, or plastic bags are now not being put into the waste stream. And so one of the supervisors said, you know what happened? As soon as we passed this law, I got calls from Boston and here and there, and I even got calls from London and Paris. And he said, I think we started a wildfire of common sense. But the point is, it's a very simple law, a very simple boundary. You don't give out plastic bags in these conditions. And look what happened. It just wildfire. So I think that this notion that human beings hate rules just doesn't get us very far. Again, to summarize what I just said there, as we align with nature's laws, then we can be relieved that we don't have to make it up anymore. And we can also recognize that when we make the rules together and they make sense to us, they can take off really fast, as Germany to San Francisco. But once I get here, and this is my last disempowering message, once I get here, then I think, oh, but I often hear my environmentalist friends, a few of them at least, say, you know, Frankie, I love, you know, democracy is your middle name, right? But, you know, we don't really have time for democracy. It's too late for democracy. We just have to go for it. We have to do whatever it takes to impose solutions on people, because otherwise there is going to be no people and nothing left to. So, you know, just the ends justify the means in this terrible situation we're in on this planet. But I think this could be the greatest mistake of all. This could be the greatest mistake of all. You know, Al Gore in just a few years has gone from changing light bulbs as his bottom line to the crisis of ecology is fundamentally the crisis of democracy. That there is no solution to the environmental crisis without solving the democracy crisis. And I profoundly agree with that. In fact, I think they are one and the same in a sense. It's best to look at them as one and the same crisis. And so what I'm really wanting to leave you with is that we now have, through this an emergent understanding of ecology and the letting go of the destructive and malaligned with our nature worldview of the mechanical worldview premised on scarcity, premised on lack of goods and goodness. We now have the possibility to emerge what I'm thinking of as an ecology of democracy that has been the missing idea. I started out saying that we are creatures of the mind, right? And linguists say that when a culture lacks a fundamental idea it needs to thrive, we should call that hypocognition. We're lacking some idea. And the idea that has been missing in our culture and the dominant culture of this planet is the idea of a living democracy. The idea of democracy not as a fixed structure, something done to us or for us, that maybe, you know, we participate in two ways. One, by voting, which is optional, and one by shopping, which is required. That's pretty much how it's boiled down to us as we're culture. That is failing. And what is emerging is a true understanding of democracy from ecological principles of ever evolving, of absolutely networked, so that it's a democracy in which our actions, our voices shape our realities moment to moment. And it is an understanding of democracy not as a set system, but as a set of system values that permeate our schoolrooms, that permeate our cultural institutions, that permeate our political system, that permeate our economic system. A set of values of fairness, of mutual accountability, certainly those two, and inclusion. So democracy then is no longer thought of as something finished and done, but as something that is co-created by us moment to moment. And that is a profound, profound shift, the filling in of a missing piece of democracy that is truly aligned with our nature, both the good and the bad, not denying our capacity for cruelty, but dispersing power so that, and sort of flipping, if you will, it's a democracy that understands that there are three things at least that cause human cruelty: concentration of power, or that result in human cruelty: concentration of power, anonymity, and scapegoating. And on each of those counts, living democracy confronts each one and reverses it. It continually disperses power. It reduces anonymity, as in the movement that you are so much leaders in. Face-to-face community building dissolves anonymity, and it rejects scapegoating. You do not say, oh, it's her fault, oh, it's his fault, oh, it's their fault. You stand up and you say, I'm accountable too for solutions. And you stop the incessant blaming that doesn't get us anywhere. So we know what it takes then to emerge, to birth this living democracy. And I just want to mention a few things about it that I see emerging, because it's your lives so much as leaders in what I think of as economic democracy, that I loved, and maybe you all know this already, but I love to remind people who aren't so in it as you are, that we think of multinational corporations and what I've come to call, I had to speak to 7th graders a few weeks ago, and I came up with a new term for it because I didn't want to say corporate globalization to the 7th graders because it sounded kind of gobbledygooky and wonky. So I said, centralized sameness. Centralized sameness. McDonald's, right? Centralized sameness. What is it? I forgot now. 31,000 outlets in 100 and something countries. Centralized sameness. So my point is, what is my point? Economic democracy is the opposite of centralized sameness, right? It is this networked. And so most people think centralized sameness has it all sewn up. But actually, there are more people who are members of cooperatives in the world than there are who own shares in publicly traded companies. Membership in cooperatives have doubled in my adult life, just in my adult life, so 30 years or so. And cooperatives provide more employment than multinational corporations. In fact, one of the shocking statistics I've read recently, when we think about centralized sameness taking over the world, actually, if you look, it's different per continent, but in Latin America, and this is fairly typical, if you look at job creation over the last 20 years or so, like 85% of the new jobs created in Latin America have been created by tiny enterprises and small businesses. It's not centralized sameness that is creating the employment for the world's people, and you know that, you are that generative power. So economic life, the democratization of economic life, and just these emblematic of course, another piece of it, of which you are part of. Again, people don't appreciate this is the whole Fairtrade movement, which wasn't even something you could use as a phrase 15 years ago and have people understand what you meant. That's how fast it has taken off. And I just read this wonderful statistic that in the UK, now many of you have been in the pubs in London, so think about that when you hear me say this. In the UK, the fair trade sector and the overall ethical sector, where people are consciously buying to align with their deeper social values, is now greater than alcohol sales in the UK. And they do love their beer. So that is not a niche anymore, right? And so how quickly that common sense approach that, of course, people who produce what we use should be paid a living wage. Whoever thought otherwise. So the democratization of economic life. But we also have to believe in the democratization of political life. Imagine that. Somebody gave me a wonderful term recently that we've evolved what can only be called privately held government. And how do we birth a truly publicly held government? So whatever else we're doing, we can weigh in on the removal of money from the political system. And what I believe the way that can work now because of the Supreme Court rulings is through voluntary public financing. And so whatever else you're doing, take a little bit of time to weigh in on that. Go to just6dollars.org, which is the national movement for voluntary public financing. There are now 2 bills, each house in Congress, bipartisan, for a real law that would make public financing for federal elections work and get money out of the system. And on that note, I just want to remind you that it's already happening in 3 states. And in 2 of those states, it has made an enormous difference in people's lives and for the environment. I'll just mention one, the state of Maine, my new superhero, who you can see in a 5-minute film on my website, smallplanet.org, the film my son made, Josie's daddy, that is, who tells us and brings to life Deb Simpson, my new superhero. Deb was a single mom, a waitress with a high school education in the year 2000. Maine has financing. Maine has voluntary public financing that they call clean elections. And so when her friends saw leadership in this waitress, they said, Deb, you should run for office. And she, like, what are you talking about? And then they told her, all you have to do is get $5 from 50 people and you can get on the ballot. She said, oh, I'm a waitress. Maybe I can do that. And she did. She's been reelected 4 times. She is now the co-chair of the Judiciary Committee of the state of Maine, and so highly she went back to school, got her college education during this period. She's now so highly regarded by other legislators around the country that the overall national body of state legislators welcomed her onto a committee to deal with maybe one of the most morally charged, for me, issues of our day, and that is how to deal with nuclear waste. So here's a woman who was a waitress in Auburn, Maine, and is now a national leader because of voluntary public financing that allows the best to emerge, not just those who can get the big bucks. So I could go on. They were able to pass a record-breaking, groundbreaking law in Maine for corporations who make electronic equipment to be fully responsible for the life cycle of their products, and have saved hundreds of thousands of pounds of dirty electronic equipment, hazardous electronic equipment from the waste stream. Anyway. So, reclaiming our democracy, both in reframing it as a living practice, a rewarding way of life, not simply as something that is done for us or to us. So I just would like to close with this. That, on a more personal note, that you can tell I'm really keyed up this morning. And I think I'm more keyed up, I'm more on edge than ever in my 64 years. And I think a lot of you of my generation share that feeling, that we are in an extraordinary moment of possibility and of collapse, both. Equally, I can't say which is more powerful. I know that both are real, and I'm trying to balance it all. And so I asked myself, what is required of me, of one, at this moment, to be alive at this extraordinary moment of choice? It is a moment of choice. And so I've come up with this little phrase to myself that I call bold humility is what's required of me. And the bold part is this. I'm making the claim that we don't need to be better people. We're good enough. We're good enough. We've got these great qualities in us. Virtually all of us do. There's some, yes, through brain damage or something, that may not have these prosocial, empathetic, and sympathetic, and fairness, hardwiredness in them. Maybe. I don't know. But most of us do. We're good enough. But the boldness factor is what we need to work on. The backbone factor, if you will. And I'm speaking for myself, not for anybody else. I'm just sharing this with you. Bold humility, what does that mean? It means that the bold part is that we evolved, remember, in these tight-knit tribes. where we learned a couple of things about fear. We learned to trust our body sensations. In my case, it's a pounding heart. We learned to trust them, that they were sound signals that we were in kind of wrong place, wrong time, better get out of there. And we also learned another message about fear. We learned that separation from the tribe was the most scary thing of all. Because we were so social, we knew that if we got booted out of the tribe, we were done for. So, we've carried these hardwired realizations into the 21st century, inevitably. But here we are. Who would have imagined? Early 21st century, and the hyper-tribe is heading over the falls. So fear has to take on an entirely new meaning. Fear, because to separate from that canoe heading over the falls, yeah, we got to do it, but it's scary. It's scary. We're nearing the edge, and it would be scary in any case to separate from the pack and to try to swim to the shore, or try to take the oars or whatever you do, paddles, I guess. Anyway, go in another direction against the current. So we are hardwired to experience what is called for us right now. What is called for us right now is to say no to that path and to say yes to a very different way that separates us even from people we love. My brother is a very, very conservative right wing. So we have to do it. And we also know that for most of us, and certainly for me, it brings up fear. And we're going to feel those sensations in our bodies, and we have to reinterpret them. We have to give them new meaning, consciously give them new meaning if we're going to find that backbone. And we have to support each other and find buddies who are going to say, go for it, and I'm going to be there with you. And so in my case, I have a cheesy trick I use. My daughter thinks it's cheesy, but it didn't. Anyway, that's another story. And that is when I get that pounding heart, which is my first symptom of being really antsy, that I'm going to fall on my face and be an idiot and get scared. I used to feel that pounding heart, and I would say, "Oh, you wimp! Come on, this is no big deal. You know, what can happen? You know, they're not going to kill you." And I would preach to myself about what a wimp I was. But now, and that didn't work because pounding. But now what I do when I feel the pounding heart, I say, inner applause. And it works. And I say, oh yeah, I'm right there. I'm pushing my edge, and I feel really good about myself. So we've got to work on that. Remember, at least Francis Moore Lappé thinks you're good enough. You don't have to work on being a better person, but, you know, help yourself and help your friends find the backbone. And so then the humility part. The humility part is a lot easier when you get old. Because here is what I'm discovering as I'm in my mid-60s now. And it's very humbling. I travel the world with my daughter, and we went to the landless workers movements in Brazil and the Greenbelt movement in Kenya and met and discovered, 58 countries in microcredit. And do you know, I have to look at my daughter, Anna, and realize that when I was her age, and if somebody had actually painted this picture that we describe in Hope's Edge as what was emerging in all these different settings, I would have said, oh, it's fiction, That's a nice fictional story, but I would give it about a 1 or 2% chance of happening. Yeah, that's humbling. Do you see what I'm saying? I realize that the things that most get me out of bed in the morning, I would have given almost no chance of success 30 years ago or 40 years ago. I've sort of said, oh, yeah, well, maybe, but not likely. I often tell the story about Organic Valley. I was just at their 20th anniversary celebration in Kickapoo, Wisconsin. And I admitted publicly that, when I met the 7 guys in 1988 and at Crop in western Wisconsin, and I thought, oh, great, a little dairy co-op. Isn't that nice for a few farmers in Wisconsin, Yeah, well, you have little faith. Here I am in Boston buying my Organic Valley, and now almost 1,300 farmers involved in a democratic worker-farmer co-op. So what I'm saying is that humility, bold humility, is this idea that it's not possible to know what's possible. It's not possible to know what's possible. And if you really, really take that in, and I was just hearing last night about this wonderful visioning session that you had, is it just the Ashland folks? But, really kind of breaking out of the limits of your, I know what's possible. And in any way in your life, if you can do what I've done at 64, if you're way too young to look back 30 years, but think of things that you thought were improbable that actually then happened. And feel that humility that then opens you to, it's not possible to know what's possible. So then we are free, right? We are truly free. And so I will close just by reflecting what I see in you and your power, that, this ecological worldview completely redefines power. Because if we truly are living and breathing an ecological worldview, then we know that we are all in relationship. We are all in dense relationships where everything we are doing is affecting everything else around us. And now that mirror neurons have been discovered, the neurons that tell us that when I'm doing this and you're watching me, then there's part of your brain that's doing this too. Oh my gosh. Think of the power that each of you have as people are observing you in each of the communities in which you function. And so as you think about that, think then about the power that you each have and that you have collectively. You have what everybody wants. You have purpose. You have meaning. You have energy. You have great buddies. You have what everybody wants. That is your power. Glory in it. Thank you. Thank
you. You've been listening to democracy advocate and world food and hunger expert Frances Moore Lappé, speaking at the annual Provender Alliance Conference in Hood River, Oregon. The title of her lecture, Liberation Ecology, Toward an Empowering Frame to Move from Crisis to Transformation. In a moment, we'll return to the question and answer session from the presentation. Frances Moore Lappé is co-founder of Food First, the Institute for Food and Development Policy, and more recently, of the Small Planet Institute. In 1987, she received the Right Livelihood Award. Her first book, which has sold over 3 million copies, is Diet for a Small Planet. The book is now recognized as the blueprint for eating with a small carbon footprint, although it was written decades before the threat of global warming had entered public awareness. Her most recent books include Hope's Edge, written with her daughter, Anna Lappé, an account of democratic social movements worldwide, and Getting a Grip, Clarity, Creativity, and Courage in a World Gone Mad, awarded the Nautilus Gold Best in Small Press Award. To find out more about Frances Moore Lappé and her work, please visit the Small Planet Institute website at www.smallplanet.org. And now we return to the question and answer session from the program. Frances Moore Lappé spoke in Mount Hood, Oregon on October 2nd, 2008.
So I don't know where we are in time, but I hope we're okay. Please. And as you're coming forward, I also wanted to mention something that I'm in the midst of right now that I hope might be of help to some of you. There are 18% of Americans are still undecided in the current historic election. And I've created with some buddies of mine a website called youdecide.org, youdecide.org, to fill a missing piece in this historic election, and that is just basic flyers, using the web to go beyond the web, just basic information, all sourced on the back of the flyer with credible mainstream sources. Try to use language that is not inflammatory, and we are going to have a flyer. Meet John McCain, then you decide. Meet Barack Obama, then you decide. And then one flyer with a contrast, and also one flyer that says how have American families fared under Republican and under Democratic administrations, where we just have a simple bar chart over the last 60 years showing how, from an economist at Princeton, put together these numbers. So we're trying to provide, remember, 18% of the people are still undecided, and we think that there's so much misinformation, so much emotional appeal, that just basic, clearly laid out fact sheets that can stimulate discussion is hopefully a tool that you could use with your family or your friends, or post somewhere. We did this in 2004, and our favorite example of how our flyers were used came from Oregon. So I'll just mention it. It was a tattoo artist, maybe he's in the audience, that he wrote to us and said, here's how I used your flyers. I have a coffee table while I do my tattoos, so I put the flyers out there. And so I had this captive audience to discuss your facts. So there are a lot of creative ways. People put them on windshield wipers in church parking lots and various things. And we invite people to send us corrections or improvements. So it's a very transparent way to just get basic information out to people who aren't all over the net and aren't, who might just respond to in a discussion. So thank you.
The first question for Frances Moore Lappé was about educational materials on these topics that are designed for children. Does the author know of books or films or audio recordings that discuss these kinds of issues and that are crafted for a younger audience?
Well, I just got an email. I mean, I'm thinking, but while I'm thinking, I was surprised and delighted that Getting a Grip is being used in a couple of high schools in Montpelier, Vermont, and that the kids in this high school 7th grade through 12th grade that I spoke to, I didn't use the term corporate globalization, but I basically laid out these ideas in a shorter form, and they were very engaged with them. So I'll think about it. I mean, I think about certainly the things that I'll think about it. I try to write in a way that at least some of these, there's a pretty straightforward in using graphics and summaries that certainly high schoolers, I don't know how far down, but certainly high schoolers can. In a number of my talks, young teenagers have come and I've talked to them and been very reinforced by what they've gotten from it. So, but maybe I should try to do that more. And so if you have ideas for how to translate what I'm saying into a more concise and clear way, that would be great. And I'll keep thinking about other resources too. Annie just told me, where's Annie? She just told me that she had been planning, and she's going to send me a comic book that we created in the 1970s, a food-first comic book explaining the roots of world hunger in comic book form. So maybe when Annie sends me that, I don't have a copy of it myself anymore, then maybe I'll be inspired to figure out how I can turn my book into a comic book. My son has written a graphic novel, so maybe he could help me. Thank you for that question, though. It gets me thinking, and I'm sure there are resources that I should be aware of. Oh, I know. One is myhero.com, myhero.org. I'm not sure, but you could find it. And it's a wonderful, wonderful website of short stories where various celebrities and other people of note have written short pieces about who their heroes are and why. And I did my hero is Mungari Maathai. I have a piece there about her. So I know a lot of teachers are using that as an inspirational source. It's not a systems analysis kind of thing like I'm doing today, but it's nonetheless a very useful resource for young people.
The next member of the audience asked the author for her thoughts about China and India and the developing world and the environment.
Thoughts about China, India, and the developing world. Well, gosh. Whoa. Well, I bet I share this with a number of you. While I'm horrified at the intensified suffering that is coming from this financial meltdown, that the other side of it, and please, it's hard for me to say this because the suffering is so real. As I mentioned, the increased hunger that is a large part of the direct result of this financial mishigas. But on the other side is that market fundamentalism, surely that rigid idea that simply the market, that we must obey the market signals, will become increasingly a joke as a result of this meltdown. That all of we've been told. So in the sense that China and any economy that is claiming that it can then operate well outside of a democratic framework is a lot less credibility, I think, as a result of this breakdown. And I think, I'll just explain what I'm trying to work on and incorporate in my writing about China and India. Part of it is a messaging question, is that we keep hearing the term rising middle class in China and India. And I think I'm not on top of it enough to know exactly how to reframe this, but my instinct tells me that is a profoundly false way of looking at it when half the people in India are living on less than $2 a day. And there are more children malnourished and stunted by hunger in India than there are in all of sub-Saharan Africa. So I think that part of what we've got to do to break the bubble that somehow India and China represent, we often hear the term miracle and economic powerhouse and middle class rising, to puncture that with the reality that yes, there is an elite group that is advancing, but there is massive suffering and dislocation, and so that just to begin to get a better grip on what is really, oh, well, yes, they have environmental problems, but they have a rising middle class, as if people in general are benefiting from it. To how do we puncture that and say, not only are they choking on pollution, but it is a very small, and I believe the figure was 60,000 organized protest in China over dislocation, environmental issues, and in general social justice, just in 1 year, a couple of years ago. And so that also, right, you don't hear about that in the daily news. We have a sense, they're going along, or David Brooks or somebody in the time referred to China as a harmonious culture. So I don't know if I'm really answering your question. I'm just so concerned about the false frame that we're now looking at China and India through, and how do we bring greater reality to that? And of course, that in terms of what everybody is saying, what makes so much sense to me is that only as we elect a new president who will take on the climate crisis and the poverty crisis at home, can we then have a leg to stand on internationally as we negotiate deals with other countries, including those in the global south. So we have to step up ourselves, or we're just finished as any kind of authority that can work toward the diminution of suffering elsewhere, and also just the sense of reinforcing the more that we can communicate how our path is not the path that leads. I mean, you all live and breathe this, but changing the frame so that how do we enable the global south to avoid this terrible, ecologically destructive path that we've taken, in poverty-creating path. So I think all of that. I don't have a short answer, obviously. I'm sorry.
The next audience member said that she had just returned from Ecuador, where the people had just voted on ratifying a new constitution, which includes rights for nature, rights for the environment. She asked if the author knew how the people of Ecuador had managed to succeed in writing into their constitution guarantees for the rights of nature, and whether she knew of other countries that have done that, or whether she thought that might ever happen here in the United States.
Oh, that's beautiful. No, I really don't know the story, but now I want to. I had it rings a faint bell, something I heard. I know in Kenya, through Wangari Maathai, the new constitution does acknowledge in some ways, I don't know the exact wording of it, but does acknowledge the protecting the well-being of all of life. And so it's not, I really want to read the language there and further it. And of course, in that same similar vein anyway, 22 constitutions in the world today protect theoretically, the right to eat, the right to food. Actually Brazil has a rapporteur, has somebody in government whose job it is to measure the advancement toward fulfilling the right to food. Can you imagine that in the U.S. government? So, and South African government is one that has the right to food as a. So I think that the more we can spread the word about, particularly, you mentioned Latin America, particularly about the advances toward this inclusive understanding of democracy, that Latin America is ahead of us, as you cooperators know, in so many brilliant ways. They are way ahead in terms of building cooperative economies. And they've now seen, long before we did, the bubble burst about somehow this automatic one rule economy could work as the neoliberal model, as they call it there, collapsed. So they're ahead of us. And so I think I know many of you are connected with people in different parts of Latin America and building solidarity. But the more we can get that story told here as different dimensions of it, the landless workers movement, for example, which we talk about in Hope's Edge, just an incredibly empowering story. That the more that we can then see ways that we are doing it, the right to eat is one way, particularly in Brazil. So thank you, and I wanted to follow up on that. And if you have any advice for where I should go first to read about it, I'd really appreciate it.
The next member of the audience said he connected to several of the author's observations, with her comments about being in business, and in particular, the fear of separation from the group, a fear of separation that is deeply connected to the fear of death. If we're trying to be innovative in our business and boldly and humbly move towards more natural and ecological models for what we do, and try to take steps toward becoming genuinely sustainable businesses, we confront this fear of separation from the group, the fear that our businesses might not make it if we take the steps that we think we have to in order to be truly sustainable, in order to do the right thing. How do we overcome that fear of separation from the group, the fear of our businesses not working, when we take the steps we need to take towards a more natural and more ecological and more democratic way of doing business?
Yes. And I think that no simple answer, of course, but I think you nailed it in a sense, because we are such social animals. Few of us can step out completely on our own, and therefore the buddy system is more important than ever. And the buddy system writ large means, for me, creating the networks where, in any case we can, and this isn't always possible, but to just keep our antennae out for those who will align, and then look for examples of those who have been just a bit ahead of us, even if it means going to travel to them. Like I had the privilege a couple of years ago, I went to Emilia-Romagna in Italy and interviewed a bunch of people who are part of perhaps the most, I think is in the capitalist world, the most successful network of cooperatives, and just learned more of the history of how they did it, so that I feel more emboldened to do what I'm doing, because I could see how they did it. And so I think any way that you or any of us can meet face to face with others who have done what you want to do, just a bit ahead, and therefore you have kind of a sounding board and a sense of in-touchness that can help diminish that fear of being absolutely out there on the end of the branch by yourself. So to acknowledge that that's human, and to acknowledge that fear of being an outcast from the tribe is part of our humanity, and not being ashamed or embarrassed by it, but work creatively with it, because of course it is also our great blessing that we are so connected to other people's views of us, and to fearing embarrassment and humiliation because of failure. So, and the more that we can, of course, many of you are doing this, the more that we can create our living circumstances so that we can take, so that we need less to feel secure, then the more risks we can take. And that, of course, is all about community too, of how through community we can reduce our need for wealth, so that we don't have to worry so much about what's going on today on the East Coast with the country's money. So I think all of these anyway, thank you for that question. Is there, yes?
The next member of the audience said that he had had a thought about what the author had said about the assumptions of scarcity and about some of these disempowering messages. We also seem to assume that intelligence is a scarce commodity, and that anybody who disagrees with us is stupid. This ties into the belief that we have to force people to do the right thing. We need to remind ourselves that more often than not, the reason people disagree with us is because they are afraid.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I hear even my good, thank you. Thank you. Because, I do hear even some close friends of mine talk about people's stupidity. I highly recommend the book, The Wrecking Crew by Thomas Frank. And he begins this book with a quote from the biography or autobiography of Lincoln Steffens. I believe it is. It's Lincoln Steffens, where it's a section of the book where he's talking about the voice speaking is a Pennsylvania politician, and he's in a conversation, and it goes like this. He said, you guys know more than Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall was the symbol of machine politics. And the Pennsylvania politician, this must have been early 1900s, said, yes, we know more than Tammany Hall. We know that public despair is possible, and it's good politics. And that is what we are experiencing today. Those who know that if Americans just despair enough, then we go along out of fear. And despair, I think, is so rampant by people who feel up against the wall, with poverty so vastly increased now just in the last 8 years. And so out of despair, then people are definitely vulnerable to being swayed by emotion. And just remember that all the polls show people have tremendous common sense when you ask them about issues. And so I agree with you. If we can show people, and that's why I created this You Decide website the way I did, and please give me your critical feedback and so I can improve it. But I think if we can engage people in just sharing why we're doing what we're doing, and presenting some basic information that is not in an emotional format, and that will help diminish the fear factor. And of course, stories, and your stories, are one powerful way to diminish the fear factor. And of course, each of you in your lives, as you're showing your own quality of life by just the way you carry yourself and the way you operate in your life, you are helping to diminish the fear of all of those around you, because they say, oh, yeah, look, there is another way to be. So thank you for nailing that so beautifully. And maybe that's a good place to stop. So thank you for all that you are doing. Thank
you. You've been listening to democracy advocate and world food and hunger expert Frances Moore Lappé, speaking at the annual Provender Alliance Conference in Hood River, Oregon. The title of her lecture is Liberation Ecology, Toward an Empowering Frame to Move from Crisis to Transformation. To find out more about Frances Moore Lappé and her work, please visit the Small Planet Institute website at www.smallplanet.org. This program was produced by pdxjustice Media Productions. To find out more about our work, and to access our growing library of free on-demand streaming video and audio programs, please visit our website at www.pdxjustice.org. You'll find presentations featuring such speakers as Paul Krugman, Barbara Ehrenreich, Noam Chomsky, Amira Haas, Jeff Halper, Susan Faludi, and many others. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access cable television, net neutrality, independent bookstores, and all forms of grassroots, democratic community media.